Today in the Daily Dose, the Progressive Era. After the excesses of the Gilded Age, muckraking journalists began to expose waste, political corruption, and corporate monopolies, at first on the state and local level. But as the Progressive Era took root from 1890 to 1920, reformers known as progressives soon trickled up into federal politics, taking aim at problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. Primarily driven by the American middle class, progressives sought to expose and eradicate political machines and their crooked bosses, believing that a higher level of direct democracy would be the result of their house-cleaning measures. Progressives also went after corporate monopolies, resulting in federal antitrust laws that further leveled the playing field for legitimate competitors. They also pushed for tighter regulations over unscrupulous manufacturers, leading to the formation of government oversight agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. During the Industrial Revolution in America, the nation emerged as a global economic powerhouse, at the same time exposing stark social and economic disparities in American society. As millions of rural Americans and foreign immigrants sought jobs in the major industrialized cities of the nation, leading to overcrowding, wretched living conditions, an increase in child labor, and an immense public health crisis due to overcrowding and inadequate sanitation practices. Political corruption was rampant in almost every industrialized city, aptly showcased within New York City's long-standing Tammany Hall political machine, which symbolized the graft and patronage systems that undermined American democracy. Tammany Hall was a political powerhouse in New York City from its 1789 inception to mayoral campaigns well into the 1950s. Its leadership was frequently aligned with the Democratic Party, and it was a major or controlling faction in the party from 1821 to 1872, and then again from 1905 to 1932, which included infamous Tammany bosses such as William Boss Tweed, Richard F. Crocker, and Charles F. Murray. Although many New Yorkers suspected that Tammany Hall was a breeding ground for graft and corruption, Tammany's popularity and remarkable longevity resulted from its willingness to help the city's poor, particularly newly arrived immigrant populations. Irish immigrants forced Tammany Hall to admit them as members in 1817, and the Irish thereafter never lost their support for Tammany Hall politicians. Perhaps the most notable of Tammany Hall leaders was Boss Tweed, who first served as a U.S. congressman representing New York's 5th District when he took office in March of 1853. At the height of his corrupt influence, Tweed was the third largest landowner in New York City, holding directorships with the Erie Railroad, the 10th National Bank, the Harlem Gaslight Company, and more. His reign over New York politics unraveled in 1877 when he was convicted for stealing an amount estimated by an alderman's committee at between $25 and $45 million, while later estimates ranged as high as $200 million. Unable to make bail, he escaped jail once but was swiftly returned to custody. He died in the Ludlow Street Jail on April 12, 1878, at 55 years of age. Reform political parties periodically took power away from the Tammany Hall crowd, but for many years it always made a comeback, until anti-Tammany Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, with the help of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was able to weaken the machine's power on a permanent basis. Despite LaGuardia's efforts, Tammany Hall retained some of its local power base until John V. Lindsay became mayor of New York in 1966. In an attempt to snuff out political corruption, progressives pushed through important reform legislation at both the federal and state level, including direct primaries, which allowed voters to select party candidates instead of party conventions controlled by political machines. The addition of initiative, referendum, and recall mechanisms gave average Americans direct control over legislation, as well as the ability to remove corrupt officials from office, while the 17th Amendment of 1913 mandated the direct election of U.S. senators by voters rather than state legislatures. While robber barons lived in opulent excess, the average adult worker survived on subsistence-level wages, while child laborers were paid even less, leading industrialists to employ more children in their factories and mills, with the added benefit that children generally lack the ability to unionize. By the mid-19th century, educational reformers began a concerted pushback against child labor practices, impressing upon the American public that proper education was a dire necessity if the nation was to prosper as a whole. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Progressive-era reformers made the end of child labor an important part of their campaign, and after the National Child Labor Committee organized in 1904, reformers employed an array of tactics to increase public awareness regarding the filthy, oftentimes hazardous conditions experienced by child laborers, including investigations by experts, the use of photography to spark public outrage, persuasive congressional lobbying campaigns, and mass mailings to the public at large. Another limiting tool against child labor practices was the Keating-Owen Act of 1916, which prohibited child labor in industries engaged in interstate commerce, an act of Congress which was later declared unconstitutional. The end finally came when the Great Depression left thousands of adult Americans out of work, leading to FDR's sweeping New Deal reforms, which in effect removed children from the workplace. The plight of American workers was further showcased in needless accidents caused by mismanagement and dangerous working conditions, including the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City. Owned by sweatshop bosses Max Planck and Isaac Harris, the Manhattan-based Triangle Shirtwaist Company was housed in the top 3 floors of the Ash Building on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, employing mostly young immigrant women who worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, all for the abusively meager pay of $15 per week. With a long history of suspicious fires in their other factories, potentially set to collect on large fire insurance policies, Blank and Harris went out of their way to resist fire safety measures at their Triangle Shirtwaist Company in case they needed another revenue-generating fire. Of the 4 elevators accessing the factory floors, only one was operational, and of the 2 stairways down to the street, one was locked from the outside to prevent theft, while the other stairway door opened inward. On Saturday afternoon, March 25, 1911, 600 workers were crammed into their sewing stations when a fire broke out in a rag bin. A manager attempted to put it out, only to discover that the fire hose had rotted, while the valve was rusted shut. Panic ensued as a long line of workers queued before an elevator that held only 12 passengers at a time. When it broke down amidst the heat and flames, terrified workers plunged down the shaft to their deaths. Others fled down the stairwells, only to burn to death when they reached the inoperable outside doors. Others jumped to their death from inadequate fire escapes, falling on fire hoses that made it difficult for firefighters to fight the flames. Within 18 minutes, the fire was over, leaving 146 innocent workers dead, while Blank and Harris and other top management escaped to the rooftop and jumped to safety on the roofs of adjoining buildings. In the wake of the tragedy, protests over worker conditions resulted in an April 5th march on New York's Fifth Avenue, with more than 80,000 in attendance, while city officials passed the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which called for massive changes to workplace fire prevention measures. And while Blank and Harris were brought up on manslaughter charges in the face of overwhelming evidence of neglect, they were ultimately acquitted by a grand jury. To settle the many lawsuits against them, Blank and Harris eventually paid out compensation to the victims' families of $75 per life lost, a mere fraction of the $400 per death settlement they received from their insurance company, making the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire an early wake-up call for union organizers throughout the United States. The Progressive Era also witnessed a number of landmark labor disputes, which put the issue of unfair labor practices and poor working conditions on the front page of most American newspapers, including the Pullman strike of 1894, the Bread and Roses strike of 1912, and the Great Steel Strike of 1919, which led to the creation of federal worker compensation laws to ensure financial support for workers injured on the job. Progressives also put the brakes on large corporations, monopolies, and trusts, ensuring fair competition and protections against consumer exploitation, leading to the enactment of antitrust legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. The period also witnessed other economic reforms, including the Hepburn Act of 1906, which strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission's ability to regulate railroad freight and passenger rates, as well as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which established a central banking system to add stability to the economy and manage the oversight of monetary policy at the federal level. Known as the Trust Buster, President Theodore Roosevelt aggressively pursued antitrust cases targeting corporations like the Northern Security Company. Born a sickly child in 1858 New York City, as a teenager, Teddy Roosevelt took up weightlifting and gymnastics, which transformed him into a strapping young man. Graduating Harvard College in 1880, Roosevelt studied law at Columbia University before his election to the New York State Assembly at age 23, losing both his wife and his mother on the same day in 1884, escaping overwhelming grief by spending the next 2 years at his ranch in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. Upon his return to New York, Roosevelt married his childhood sweetheart, Edith Kermit Carroll, raising 6 children over the coming years. Following an unsuccessful 1886 run for mayor of New York, President Grover Cleveland awarded Roosevelt a job at the U.S. Civil Service Commission, followed by President William McKinley's choice as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where Roosevelt's participation with the Rough Riders made him a standout war hero following the end of the Spanish-American War, an image which won him the governor's office for the state of New York. In 1900, after campaigning as William McKinley's running mate, covering 24 states and some 21,000 miles by train, McKinley won the White House after a landslide victory over Democrats William Jennings Bryan and Adlai Stevenson. Following McKinley's assassination on September 6, 1901, 42-year-old Teddy Roosevelt transformed the public image of the presidency with his youth and vigor, becoming the first president of the Progressive Era, where he unfurled his square deal domestic program, promising to mediate between the conflicting interests of capital and labor, of isolationism and expansionism, of land conservation and development, all with the intent of stabilizing American society. Roosevelt's 2 terms in office witnessed the successful breakup of a railroad monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act, while mediating an equitable settlement of a coal miner strike in Pennsylvania. He also set aside some 200 million acres as protected national forests, while preserving 86 million acres of ancestral Native American lands. From a foreign policy standpoint, Roosevelt coined the motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," which he applied liberally in his dealings in Latin America, including the successful secession of Panama from Colombia, which paved the way for the construction of the Panama Canal. He also successfully meddled in affairs outside the Western Hemisphere, winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his negotiations to end the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which included Japan's acceptance of an ongoing U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Avowing not to run for a 3rd term as president, Roosevelt formed the Progressive or Bull Moose Party in 1912 after President William Howard Taft failed to live up to his promises for progressive reforms. Shot in the chest by a fanatic would-be assassin while campaigning for president in Milwaukee, Roosevelt quickly recovered, at the same time losing his third bid for the White House to Woodrow Wilson due to Roosevelt's division of Republicans during a three-party election cycle. He passed away on January 6, 1919, after suffering a pulmonary embolism in his sleep, making Teddy Roosevelt one of the most dynamic leaders in American history. Deeply concerned with addressing social inequalities and improving the lives of marginalized groups, progressives advocated for minimum wage standards and improved workplace safety, including the landmark case of Muller v. Oregon in 1908, which upheld laws limiting women's work hours. The period also witnessed the rise of settlement houses such as Jane Addams Hull House, which provided education, healthcare, and support services to newly arrived immigrants and the urban poor. And while civil rights for African Americans was largely overlooked by the progressive movement, figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Ida B. Wells laid the groundwork for the future civil rights movement and legislation of the 1960s. Public health and education also became a top priority during the Progressive era, which saw a steep rise in campaigns to combat filth diseases such as typhus, typhoid, cholera, and diphtheria, primarily through improvements to sanitation infrastructures in overcrowded cities. Inspired by muckraking journalism like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, the period also saw the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, overseeing the safety and labeling of consumer products. During the Industrial Revolution, in an age before the discovery of antibiotics, tuberculosis was widely associated with dirty, crowded, unhygienic living conditions commonplace amongst crowded cities in both Europe and North America, leading to the proliferation of open-air tuberculosis sanitariums that subjected their patients to as much fresh air and sunlight as possible. Schools soon followed suit, beginning in 1904 Germany before spreading rapidly across the European continent. The movement came to the United States in 1908, first in Rhode Island, where shivering children endured outdoor classrooms even during New England's frigid winters, wrapping themselves in Eskimo sitting bags while warming their feet on heated stones. The movement reached its peak by 1918, when some 130 American cities embraced the open-air school movement. Conservation and environmentalism was another major focal point for progressives, leading to the establishment of national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges, leading to the creation of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, which was chartered to manage public lands, followed by the Antiquities Act of 1906, which authorized the president to designate national monuments. Of the 6 U.S. presidents to preside in office during the Progressive era, Woodrow Wilson stands out as a polar opposite to the rough-and-tumble persona of Teddy Roosevelt. Born in 1856 Virginia, Woodrow Wilson graduated Princeton in 1879 before attending UVA Law School, followed by a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, before teaching jurisprudence and politics at Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and Princeton, becoming the 13th president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910. During his time as an educator, he also published the 5-volume History of the American People, which romanticized both the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan, before winning the New Jersey governor's office in 1910, where he captured national attention as a progressive reformer. At age 56, Wilson won the White House in 1912 in a landslide election over a divided Republican Party, becoming the last American president to arrive at his inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage. During his first term in office, Wilson's progressive reforms included the Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduced tariffs on imports while imposing a new federal income tax. He also established the Federal Reserve to provide oversight over the nation's banking system and money supply, as well as the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission for the policing of unfair business practices. He also led the push for child labor laws, while establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad employees and a system of government loans for farmers. On the downside, however, he reversed hard-fought gains for African Americans by resegregating a number of federal agencies, effectively undoing important gains in racial equality since post-Civil War Reconstruction. Winning a second term by a narrow electoral margin, Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," ended in early 1917, when Germany began the systematic sinking of U.S. merchant ships. When U.S. officials learned about the Zimmermann telegram, which exposed Germany's plot to draw Mexico into World War I on the side of Germany in exchange for land ceded to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War, on April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, a decision which ultimately hastened the end of the First World War. In a January 1918 speech to Congress, Wilson outlined his 14 points to prevent future world wars, proposing a League of Nations to arbitrate international disputes between nations. A year later, he helped to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference, which placed untenable reparations on Germany and ultimately led to the Second World War. His second term also saw the ratification of the Volstead Act, which brought prohibition to America on January 17, 1920, as well as passage of the 19th Amendment that same year, which gave women the right to vote. Leaving office in March of 1921, he passed away at his Washington, D.C. home on February 3, 1924, making the life and public policies of Woodrow Wilson a productive yet complex figure in 20th century history. Despite its many successes, the Progressive Era was not without its shortcomings. The Prohibition movement, for instance, while well-intentioned, led to widespread noncompliance, lawlessness, and the rise of organized crime, while the era's push to Americanize immigrants muzzled cultural diversity with its heavy-handed assimilationist policies. On the plus side, however, the period's legacy continues to shape American society and governance even to this day, laying the groundwork for the modern federal regulatory bureaucracy while expanding democratic participation in the quest for social justice, environmental conservation, as well as political and economic reforms that carried over into the New Deal policies of the 1930s, as well as the civil rights movement of the 1960s, making the Progressive Era one of the most transformative periods in American history. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.